I wanted to talk about the use of some terms that I find misleading or ambiguous or just sort of a bad way of using certain words. I don't want to get into a semantic conquest debate about, this is the right way to use a word. I'm just talking about ways that I find useful and more generally applicable. Because some of these words can be used for certain things, don't really have other words to describe them. So I'll just try to explain by getting into it. The word power and liberty are two extremely vaguely used words, not just by libertarians or what have you, but by a lot of people. Power is the ability to control things. Power is the ability to cause what you want to happen. It can be the fact that you have a recognized claim to run a certain corporation, which is a set of contracts and whatnot, or that you have a certain ability or technical talent or intellectual ability or influence over other people. These are all kinds of powers. Being able to beat somebody up is power. Being able to buy, stocks, company, and cause things that you want to happen to come about, that's all power. And so one thing I don't like is how a lot of people, including Mises, who I generally agree with, will make a distinction between economic power and state power. And there certainly is a difference in kind, but they're both power. State power is a sort of violent coercion that does not work by what we might call proprietarian or liberal norms. It is a violation of what is, in many ways, a pretty common rule set for how to act in society. Even in places that I wouldn't call libertarian, it would be unacceptable for a person to do the things that the government does. I'm not talking morally, I mean just de facto legally. People would not put up with it if they could do anything about it. So, I think power should just be used in the way to say it's your ability to do things. And if you're talking about a specific kind of power, then dealing it that way. But don't act like power is just state power or whatever. These are all different ways that we can enforce our subjective preferences on the world to make it conform to some state we desire. Power is economizing in action. And the term freedom and liberty, freedom to be free and so forth, that's a problematic one, because to be free of something just means not to have it. I'm free of disease when I don't have a disease. The price is free when I don't have to pay anything. There's no price. Of course, there's always a subjective price, but I won't bother with that, because it still makes sense within the context of Cadillacsy. So, when you're talking about freedom, what do you mean by that? I mean, freedom from what? And when you say you want freedom, do you really want? Do you want to be free of your place in this society where the government runs after you? If you want to be free of that, you can swim into the ocean or run into the forest. It's obviously something more than freedom you want. You want power too. You want the power to be able to do other things. You want to be at liberty to do things, which is another term often conflated with freedom. It doesn't have exactly the same connotation. Liberty just means the ability to act as you please. You're at liberty to do something if it's within your feasible range, for one thing, if you have power to do it. And you might say, in a more narrow kind of jurisprudential sense, that you're at liberty to do something if it's not recognized as a tort, and people do not make claims within the legal structure that you should be prevented from doing something because it violates some other person's recognized liberty or property claim or whatever. actually think this term, liberties or liberty, is probably a lot better than the term rights. The term rights comes from covenants. It comes from covenants, which includes contracts. It also includes sort of social covenants or imaginary religious covenants, like with God or whatever. And a right is something that you have a right to certain things. You have a right to salvation if you accept Jesus or whatever, because these are the terms of the covenant. So you have a right to something. Somebody else has a duty to provide it. Now, people talk about there being negative rights, which is sort of what I mean by liberties, but it's also kind of a bizarre use of the term, because what would it mean to have a negative right? A right is something that you can be provided with. A negative right would be, just try to do the mental exercise of, you've got a contract, one person has a right to something, another person has a duty to perform it. And now invert that. What is it? There's no opposite of that. There's no negative version of that. It doesn't make any sense. Another person having a duty to not do something is still a right. It's not a negative right. Or it's still a duty for them. It's not a negative right, and it's not a negative duty. And I think the term liberties is generally much more useful and meaningful. Then there's another thing I want to talk about, which is property. I would understand property as being anything you can exercise your power over. Anything you can exercise control over is your property. Somebody steals your car, it's his property. He may not have a property claim to it, or you may think it's illegitimate or whatever, and society at large may recognize your right to get it back or to get some recompensation from the guy that took it. But as long as he is still the person controlling and deploying those resources, it's his property. And I don't think this should be really controversial, except for the sort of moralistic fantasies that a lot of libertarians have built up around property. But I mean, it's just, property is what you have control over. This is standard definition in economics, for example. It's your de facto control. And I'll make a point of this, that it's not just your de jure control or some mysterious ownership, because Mises points out, if you completely regulate an economy, the de jure property ownership or any imagined right that people say you have to the property is meaningless, because you don't have de facto control. It's that de facto control that makes a difference. The de jure stuff can certainly help you maintain de facto control, and it may be useful for other reasons, but it's not the same as property. A property claim is not the same as property. Okay, so after that I'm going to talk about the objectification of humans and humans as property. A lot of people don't like the way you talk if you objectify people. You talk about them as objects. So of course, it's ridiculous. People are objects. They are certain kinds of objects, but they are obviously objects. They exist in the world, and they have certain properties, and they do certain things that can be interacted with. They're objects in the same sense that a pencil is an object. They're not pencils, but they are an object like a pencil. And so I cannot understand why people get upset about the objectification of humans, except for those people that think, human beings are magical, nonsensical ghosts in a shell or something like that. And then property in humans. It's possible to have property in humans in the de facto sense, in that you can control what another person does, whether or not you have a de jure right. And people will say, well, unless you're physically manipulating them, they still have some volition in the matter, and that's true. So does a dog. It doesn't mean it's not my property. If I can get it to do what I want, by whatever means, then it's under my control, it's under my power, and it's my property. And property in humans is the same thing. If you can control a person, that's your property. If you have a claim to the ownership of a person, then you have what you might call a de jure property claim, or property right, if you like to use that annoying term. And then finally, I just want to talk about authority. I touched on this in an earlier video, but authority is basically the social version of power. Authority is your recognized ability. You have a right of command.